In this video, we're going to be covering Chapter 9 with the topic Language and Thought. Now, we have our roadmap for the chapter here. We're going to talk about how we develop language, and I suppose we'll start by talking about what language is, and also what it isn't. We'll then look at some of our milestones and theories of how we develop language. We'll look at some of the different structures in our brains that are related to understanding and producing language. We'll look at some of the discussions on what the purpose of language might be, specifically focusing on how we form representations or classify objects. I'll get to talk about categorization, one of my favorite topics to chat about. And then we'll talk about problem solving, some of the different strategies and approaches and different ways that we might think when approaching these problems. So that's the plan. We'll see how far we get in each video, but to get started, we'll have our discussion of what is language. So language is the grouping of spoken, written, or gestured symbols that can be used to convey information. Now, as per usual, this is not an exhaustive definition. This doesn't tell us everything that something has to include in order to be classified as language. This is just the basics, the bare bones here. And the reason I'm making this distinction is actually because of something that I've done research on myself. I mentioned before, I do research with black-capped chickadees and how they communicate and how they form concepts and categories. So this is an area that's very close to my heart. But when we look at communication, there's a little bit of a discussion about, okay, well, what's the distinction between communication and language? So language can be one form of communication, one way of passing information from one organism to another, but with language, we're adding some extra caveats. Usually things along the line of being able to intentionally pass information, where you have that willingness to take something that you know and share it with someone else. So I am willingly sharing the knowledge that I'm sort of lecturing about today with you, and you are hopefully interpreting and internalizing that information that you have been receiving. So I'm doing that here with spoken, but also written language because of the words on the slides. But I will also specify that while we do acknowledge that there are multiple formats for language, written, spoken, gestured, all of them, most of the research and almost all the research we'll talk about in this chapter are focusing on spoken language. And that's because that's the type of language that they think has been around the longest, though there's a lot of debate and a lot of interest nowadays getting into gestured language, because that could have been around even before we had the vocal structures capable of producing spoken language. But that is a whole can of worms that I cannot go off onto too many tangents about. But what we care about here is that we're acknowledging that language is a way to communicate, but not all forms of communication count as language. And to help stress that distinction between communication and language, we actually have a case study here. And I chose this case study because, while there are lots of different examples that people will point to and say, look, communication or language from a non-human animal's perspective. More recently, we've seen a lot of, say, videos on TikTok with dogs who have all of those buttons arranged, and they can press buttons in different orders to ask for things or to tell you things. And people can have the debate of, does that count as language? You can look at parrots and how they can sort of imitate what they've heard. Does that count as language? And most of the research and a bunch of the case studies we'll see throughout the chapter, I believe, will circulate around other primates. So we can look at gorillas and chimpanzees and even orangutans that have been taught various forms of language, whether it be gestured, pictorial, or even in rare cases, the ability to produce a small subset of words. But those are sort of the standards. So when I was exposed to this one special case study of Kaushik, who is a Korean elephant, this was one of those stories that was famous in news headlines for a very brief window because Kaushik can speak up to 7 different Korean words, with the potential for learning more as time goes on. And I included a video, I've left the link up on our e-class, but if you watch it, you actually get to see how Kaushik makes these sounds, basically putting his trunk in his mouth and exhaling to produce the right vibrations to make those words sort of audible in the air. So it's not the same way that where we have an internal ability to use our vocal cords, but still making use of forming the right shape with their mouth and using their trunk to allow those vibrations to make the correct sounds. And a lot of the words have come from imitating his caretakers. And this has been sort of touted as this really exciting new form of communication between these species because it's across species. But we'll probably agree fairly quickly, especially where there's only 7 or so words that he can produce, this isn't really going to be enough to count as language. There's probably going to be some extra requirements, like I've said. And so in this case, we're just getting imitation or mimicking, and we don't necessarily see any of the things that would make us think that it's language. And one of the concepts that's really closely related to this sort of lack of diversity in words, but also lack in creativity in how those words are combined, this ties to the concept of productivity. And productivity is this idea that you can put things into different orders to create new messages that you might not have heard before. Specifically, showing that you are doing more than just mimicking words or phrases that you've heard in your encounters, but you're actually understanding how they go together and producing a novel message that would have novel information. And of course, in this situation, we definitely don't see that. So if I've spent enough time talking about, well, what does something have to have? What boxes do we need to tick for something to be called language? We have a bunch of different properties, and there's a lot of debates around which ones are and are not necessary. But for our purposes, we're going to boil it down to 4 main properties of language. So for something to count as language, it has to hit all of these requirements. So the first of which is that it must be symbolic. And that means that you're using sounds or words that are going to be representing objects and actions and events and ideas. Just means that this isn't something that needs to be physically present. I like using the example of the word dog. So I can talk about a dog without having to physically show you a dog. The word itself doesn't necessarily directly relate to the thing, the concept, but we've learned that those sounds put together means that creature that you've seen in other places. So you're able to connect this symbolic representation with the actual thing itself. So that symbolic nature means that we can now talk about things that don't have to be physically present. We can also talk about theoretical things because it is all symbolic and allows us to have some kind of internal representation of whatever the concept is that we're discussing. We also need this thing to be semantic. So for something to be a language, there has to be some meaning behind the sounds or the symbols. So the letters that make up the word dog, when they are put together, they mean that concept of a dog. So there is meaning behind all of the components that we're going to look at. So whether it be sort of the small pieces that give us our words, or when we combine them into sentences, they're all able to convey some level of meaning to us. Next, we have this idea of generativity, and this means that a limited number of symbols, whether they're sounds or letters or whatever, things can be combined in an infinite number of ways to generate those novel meanings. It relates nicely to productivity, but we're just generating an infinite number of combinations that can get across new information. And this is really important because we'll start looking at things like, well, how many distinct sounds can we produce? Okay, how many distinct words are there? Okay, now how many distinct phrases? And as we add complexity or get into larger units, we're going to find that there are more and more possibilities, to the point that we could argue that there are an infinite number of sentences that could theoretically be produced just using the English language. There's all sorts of generativity there. And then our last point, before I get too far off the beaten path, is to talk about structure. So language has to be structured. We have rules that govern how words are put into phrases and sentences. So we will eventually talk about grammar, which is our overarching collection of rules that tells us how stuff should be combined. And each language is going to have their own subset of rules that tells us what is and is not proper language for that specific type of language. Now, I have promised a discussion about sort of building up in terms of complexity, going from, say, sounds to words to phrases and so on. So we actually end up having a bunch of labels for each of those, which shouldn't be super surprising. But I'm going to end up hopping back and forth between this diagram here that shows sort of the smallest units up to larger units, but also here where we have the definitions that go along with those. So the first, being our smallest possible units, are phonemes. And phonemes are our smallest units of speech. They are specifically the smallest distinct sounds that can be produced. So these are all the little noises that our mouths are capable of producing. And so when researchers have isolated about 100 possible phonemes, 100 unique sounds that humans are capable of producing, but most languages don't use all of them. They're going to range somewhere between 20 and 80 for what languages tend to use. Some languages are therefore very simple sound-wise, and some can be very complex sound-wise. And English sits somewhere in the middle. We only use about 40 of the possible 100 phonemes that exist. So right in the middle of the road. And when we talk about these phonemes, these different sounds, we do have rules about how we can combine those sounds. So these are called our phonological rules, rules that indicate how phonemes get combined to form words. So certain sounds can follow others, and some sounds can't follow others. That might also explain why it's really difficult for you to maybe pronounce something, a word that we've borrowed maybe from a different language, where we have two sounds together that never co-occur in our native language, but they co-occur in this new word that we've borrowed. We might struggle because that combination goes against our phonological rules. And again, different languages have different rules. So those are our smallest units, including all the possible sounds we can make. What's our next sort of step up in terms of size? These are our morphemes. And morphemes are our smallest units of meaning in language. So our phonemes don't necessarily have to mean anything. They're just distinctive sounds. But morphemes have to have some form of meaning. They should tell us some useful piece of information. And so here we could include things like root words. So I'll use my standard. We can talk about the word bird. And so if I talk about a bird, that is a morpheme. But morphemes can also include things like prefixes and suffixes. So if I say that I have birds, plural, that S at the end is a suffix that tells us something about the root word it's been added to. So that S is actually both a morpheme because it has a unit of meaning, but it's also a distinctive sound, so it counts as a phoneme. And if you don't quite visualize that just from the words, we can actually use this diagram for what its purpose is, where we can use here the word strangers, where we've said, okay, so strange is the root word. ER is one of our suffixes that's saying that it is a person who is strange, stranger. And then by adding that S at the end, strangers, that's a Z sound. And that S at the end is also a morpheme in and of itself because it's a thing that assigns meaning. So we've learned strange, ER, is a person who is strange, and now there is more than one person who is strange. So all of these are giving us distinct meanings that modify the original word. And if we look down at the bottom here, these phonemes are just different sounds, and you'll find some of them are just letters, and that's nice and straightforward, but some of them end up being these modified letters or symbols, and each of those symbols just corresponds to a certain sound. So if you've ever looked up a word in the dictionary and in brackets they have that pronunciation guide, that'll also include these symbols in many cases so that you know exactly which sounds are combined in which order in order to make that word sort of sound correct. So this is just a visual representation of that so that we can map it onto what we've talked about here. And so, yeah, with our morphemes, we have those root words, prefixes, and suffixes. And because we're taking this sort of very small number of possible sounds, and we have those rules on how we can combine them into these word components, we then can make up to or more than 50,000 morphemes in the English language. And these can change as we add and modify words, especially with new technology. And just like we have rules on how we can put phonemes together to form words, how we combine sounds for words, we also have morphological rules. And these are rules that indicate how morphemes are combined to form words. So you're going to end up with rules at pretty much every level. We will then talk about how there are rules for putting words into orders to form sentences, and so on and so forth. So we have rules for pretty much everything. And I suppose since I'm talking about that and I'm on this slide, the bottom point here, looking at syntax, is actually our system of rules that we use for arranging words into sentences. So we have a proper name for that instead of just something that modifies the words that we're talking about combining. But yeah, so syntax, how we combine words in the right order into sentences. And just like our phonological rules and morphological rules, syntax will have sort of different applications with different languages. So every language is going to have some variation upon these rules. Though we will eventually talk about the fact that there are a lot of consistencies, even across languages, that gives us some idea of the universal nature of language. But that is for later discussion. And we've already talked before about semantics being the meaning of the words and the words as they've been combined, because adding to them can slightly change our meaning. Like here, that's just talking still about semantics. And so we covered phonemes and morphemes, and we mentioned how they're put together into words. If we go up that hierarchy, we can then have phrases and sentences, which don't get their own definitions because these are terms that we're actually able to use and recognize without needing special definitions. So we know what words are, we know what phrases are, we know what sentences are, we just needed the baseline stuff to get there. And I believe I've mentioned this already, but the overarching term to talk about all of these rules, all of these systems that we have that control how language is formed, we call that collection grammar. So grammar can look at our different rules for forming words, how we can modify those words using different tenses. So past tense versus future tense, walk versus walked versus walking. And we can look at syntax as a sort of subcategory of grammar. So grammar is that bigger overarching collection, and syntax is just one subcategory of grammar. I always stress this because I used to have a difficulty telling the difference between grammar and syntax, but syntax is just a more narrowed set of rules, and grammar is all the rules. Now, these next two slides are more of a sort of talking point, I suppose. I don't want you to memorize all the different milestones. I mainly want to show that there is a sort of structured list of when we start seeing certain abilities within children. So I have two different tables from two different textbooks. They're covering mainly the same information, but what I really wanted to do was use these as sort of a talking point to cover some of the important information. And so I kind of like this one to start with just because it's a little bit simpler, but you can look at both for curiosity's sake. But I'm going to hit the high points. So when we see right off the bat, so from birth to 3 months of age, we see that babies have a ability to orient towards sounds. This means that when they're born, they've had that chance for their auditory senses to develop because their ears work while they're in the womb. So they're surrounded by sounds. That's why there are studies that show that they recognize the sounds of their parents' voices, or they show that they recognize specific songs or stories read by specific people. So we know that sort of our ability to hear develops really early, and so we are born with that ability to localize sounds in space. It will absolutely refine as we get older, but it starts a lot earlier than some people might have thought. We also see fairly early on that we produce different sounds, coos and gurgles, and eventually we start babbling. And babbling is really exciting because this is where we see that humans have this ability to basically speak any language. So if you look at all of the sounds included within a baby's babbling, especially in those early months, you are going to find all of those possible phonemes for all possible languages. As they're exposed to whatever language is spoken in their home, then the babies are going to drop the sounds that they don't hear and specialize with the sounds in the language that they will eventually come to speak. So if you find that, say, a child is in a home and they're only speaking English, they're going to drop the other 60 phonemes and keep around just the 40 that are used in English. So we specialize by listening to others around us, and then we get rid of the sounds that we don't need. So this shows us that a little bit more of that universality that I was hinting at. More universality is that when babies start producing those almost words, things like mama and dada, those words are almost always some of the baby's first, and that sort of parent name is similar across cultures. So whatever language you speak, one of the first things that your child says will be some simplified version of whatever they call parents in that language. So that, again, a little bit of universality across cultures will be of use later on. We also start seeing, once children start producing their own words, we see a distinction between two concepts. One of these concepts is expressive language, and expressive language is what you are capable of talking about. So how many words does a child know? They can say mama and dada. They would probably be able to ask for a bottle. So just simple, easy words. However, you find very quickly that while their expressive language might be very limited, their receptive language, meaning the words that they can understand, is actually a lot broader than the number of words that they can produce themselves. This is why you can typically find that children are able to follow directions, or if you tell them to look at something or do something or whatever you come up with, there are simple phrases that they understand, even if they wouldn't be possible of generating something that complex themselves. So we have this difference between your receptive abilities and your expressive abilities. And I found this really interesting to discuss because it's not something just for children. If you've tried learning a new language, I recently started trying to relearn French. I took it all the way through high school and then dropped it for a very long time. And I find that I'm very good at sort of listening to or reading the language, but I am absolutely terrible at trying to say something or generate something myself. So my receptive language is much higher than my expressive language, just like we see with children. So this is a fairly common thing. I had just never seen it put into words until I started teaching in this area. And once we get into some of the later on milestones, sort of 2 years and onwards, we start seeing this massive increase in their vocabulary. They start learning words very, very rapidly. If we look at the average vocabulary size across a couple of milestones, by first grade, most children are going to speak in the range of about 10,000 different words. By fifth grade, they're going to speak 40,000 words. And by the time they leave high school, they're going to speak up to 100,000 words. So these numbers get higher and higher. There is always sort of a range on how sort of much or little they think that they will speak. So for example, that high school number, I think the 10,000 is on the upper end of the estimate. So it might be like between 50 and 100,000, but the specific numbers don't matter too much. We're just caring that this is a huge influx of information for a child to learn. And in fact, if we look at 2-year-olds, so right at the beginning when they're sort of rapidly acquiring language and getting much better at using it, some 2-year-olds are learning as many as 20 new words a week. That's a huge number of words to learn. And actually, that rapid rate of learning is something that people will focus on to explain that maybe there's more to it than just we're learning because someone is teaching us. Maybe there's something innate or some kind of predisposition towards acquiring language to help us acquire them that quickly. So we'll see some of those discussions a little bit later on. And like I said, when I first brought up these diagrams, I don't need you to know the specifics or the order of all of these different milestones. This is mainly giving us some talking points and also showing that there is this sort of predictable pattern in which children will sort of work through each of these milestones. And we will always acknowledge that there will definitely be individual differences. So we have some notes at the bottom down here saying that, yeah, there will be some variation. Some children will learn faster or slower than others. And there are all sorts of environmental factors that can influence this. Things like, do the children read a lot or not at all? What kind of schooling do they have? And so on and so forth. But we're just using these, like I said, as a reference point, but not something to memorize. So with all of that general information about language out of the way, we can start moving into some of our theories about how people think that we acquire language. So our main categories are going to be the behaviorist explanations, we'll look at the nativist explanations, and then eventually we'll look at the interactionist or emergentist explanations. And this last category is kind of a mixed bag because clearly we've seen there's a bunch of different names here. But these are going to be any of the theories that kind of bridge the gap between our behaviorist and nativist explanations. And we'll have some big names for each of these. So behaviorists, we think Skinner. Nativists, we think Chomsky. There's always a couple of alternative names that could be used. But we're going to talk about each of these in more detail. And then after we've explained a bunch of those, we'll briefly discuss the potential for that interaction between language and thought, which is what the chapter is named after. But we'll also look at the potential for integrating culture. Though, of course, we will mention culture throughout these discussions because we're going to be looking for evidence that supports or refutes each of the theories that we discuss. And looking at similarities and differences across cultures, across different languages and different places, will definitely help us find that evidence. So all of this is going to kind of bleed together a little bit, but we get our basic roadmap to start. Now, for those of you who have taken 104, you might remember Skinner being our example when we talked about radical behaviorism, because he had some pretty extreme perspectives on the importance of operant conditioning and environmental influences on learning behaviors. Now, if you haven't taken 104, that is totally fine too, because we will talk about Skinner as a radical behaviorist. So step one is, what do we mean by behaviorism? And behaviorism is just one of our perspectives, one of our ways of thinking about what's important when we're studying psychology. So behaviorists like Skinner would focus in on how essential our external interactions with our environment are for our ability to learn and change our behavior. So Skinner was famous for his sort of development of operant conditioning. And so if I ever talk about operant boxes or Skinner boxes, when we're talking about sort of learning tasks, and that's what we use with our chickadees to see how they form categories, is we use operant boxes. It's basically a situation in which we can present different consequences for your actions. So in your environment, your behavior can lead to a consequence that is either good or bad. So for our birds, they hop into the feeder when they hear sound A and they get food. That good consequence means that the next time they hear sound A, they are likely to hop in the feeder. If they hop in the feeder after hearing sound B, the lights turn out. So that's a bad outcome. So the next time they hear sound B, they will not hop in the feeder. And that's a very sort of clinical operant box explanation, but look at real life. So if you are learning how to drive and you come up to a stop sign and you have your parent in the sort of passenger seat giving you instructions, if you stop at the stop sign when you're supposed to, they might sort of nod in approval or tell you that, like, yes, you did it the right way. Whereas if you run that stop sign, then they're going to scold you. You're going to get in trouble. You would then be less likely to run that stop sign in the future. So you are more likely to do those good behaviors because they get you good consequences, and you are less likely to do bad behaviors that get you bad consequences. And so we see a shift in your behavior to do the right things and avoid the wrong things because of what you've learned through your interactions with your environment. And so what do all of those very strange and unconnected concepts mean, or examples mean? Well, in this situation, Skinner is treating language as a verbal behavior. So the sounds that you make are the behaviors that people can then either give you good consequences for or bad consequences for. So if a child pronounces a word properly, maybe we go right back to that mama and dada. And when they do that, their parents are really excited. They're really happy about it. And that positive reaction, that excitement, is going to make the child more likely to make those sounds again in the future. Because this got a good reaction last time, so let's do it again. Whereas if they say something that doesn't mean anything, they might get no reaction at all. So they're not going to be encouraged to make those sounds again. We could also go further, say an older child, and they've learned that if they go into the kitchen and ask for a cookie, so they'll probably say something that's more like telegraphic speech, where we boil it down to the very bare bones, and you say, give cookie, then you're likely to get a cookie. And if that's the case, you wanted a cookie, you said the word cookie, and you got a cookie, then that's a positive outcome. That is a good outcome. Your consequence was a good one. You're more likely to do it again. If you maybe mix up the word for cookie with something else, maybe you thought you were asking for a cookie, but you asked for a cracker or something else that is not a cookie. And so you ask for what you think is a cookie, you get something else, and that's not the outcome you wanted. So that bad consequence means that the next time you want a cookie, you're going to try a different word because the one you used didn't get you the outcome you wanted. So we could see that shift in behavior where you become more likely to ask for the things or use the words that get you that good reaction, and you avoid the things that get you a bad reaction. So that sets us up with this idea that, well, yeah, we could explain all of language learning just by saying that, okay, you are positively reinforced for the good things that you say, the correct use of words, and then you would be punished or get no response when you use the incorrect words. And so eventually we'd have a correction process so that children should be able to produce language normally. And as I said, we'll look at evidence for and against each of these theories. So what's the evidence for this theory? There's a bunch of different studies that have tried to look for evidence for this. I've listed a couple of interesting ones here. You don't need to know the specifics of any of these. I just figured we'd cover a couple that are often brought up. So we have 2006, 2001, and then we can go all the way back to the 80s for another. But you're going to find that a lot of these studies are not direct support for this theory. They're a little bit more indirect, and we'll find why when we look at the evidence against this theory. For our first point here, they were looking at children's caretakers and the way that they spoke and the way that they spoke in response to things that the children had said. And they found that specific speech patterns, especially speech patterns with very clear enunciation, usually slower patterns of speech with emphasis in places that make sense, was usually associated with improved word recognition in young children. So being able to sort of hear things clearly and be exposed to things clearly improved their language recognition abilities. So in that case, better sort of responses, better stimuli in your environment are leading to better performance on the side of the children. And that environmental component definitely ties into our behaviorist focus on the importance of things that we encounter in our environment. So yeah, indirectly, it can support the theory we've been discussing. Similarly, we looked at that older 80s study where they had children who displayed stuttering. So they struggled to put words together without sort of repeating words or getting stuck on words and things like that. And they adjusted the ways that their mothers spoke to them. So if they get the mothers to speak more slowly and usually therefore more clearly, it encouraged the children to also speak more clearly and more slowly and help reduce the amount of stuttering they saw. So that environmental feedback and them copying what they experienced their mothers doing for speech patterns led to an improvement in their ability to produce words themselves. So again, not directly related, but still, the environment is affecting their language abilities, therefore it counts. And then the last one, this is a little bit closer, and this is why we talk about it at the end. And this is that study in 2001 where they looked at getting their parents and guardians to use things like encouragement and praise when children were speaking. So if they say something, you're going to agree with them. If they're sort of doing something that you want them to keep doing, you praise them. You get that positive reinforcement, that good consequence. And even things like elaborating on play with children. So if the child is playing make-believe with blocks, they encourage these parents and guardians to participate and to add to that play environment. So they're introducing other words that relate to what they're doing and building on the words that the children are already using. And all of this shows a correlation with how quickly they reach their language milestones. So more of this interactive sort of environment leads to faster arrival at those language milestones. So a more supportive environment leads to faster learning, which is why this one is a much closer match to the theory that we've been talking about. So all of these are giving us some evidence that yes, the environment is very important in our language learning. However, with Skinner and with his radical standpoint, he argued that It's not just that the environment and these consequences are important in language learning. He went so far as to say that they are the only factor that's involved. He said that there is no internal process involved. There's nothing genetic. There's nothing cognitive that we care about. It is all sort of actions and sort of consequences from the environment. It is all driven externally. Hence the radical behaviorist label. And so while we can have some parts of this environmental theory or behaviorist theory being acceptable, we do see that, yeah, the environment plays a role, but we very rarely go as far as Skinner did, saying that it's absolutely everything. It is definitely not everything. So why are we sure that it's not everything? Let's cover some of the evidence against the theory. One of our biggest issues with this theory is something that I've been dropping not so subtle hints for as we went through all of the different abilities and the milestones already. So Skinner's theory can't come anywhere close to explaining this overwhelming and rapid development of human language in early childhood. I mentioned the fact that we have some toddlers around that 2-year age who are learning 20 or more words a week. With that sort of operant conditioning, that learning from consequences in your environment model, that can't explain those things being learned that rapidly. They could explain some words being learned a week, but not in the scale of like 20 or so. So they're pointing to that and saying, okay, well, if you can't explain this rapid acquisition of vocabulary, then what good is this model? So to try and explain how we can learn things this quickly, a lot of others, specifically we'll talk about Chomsky and his nativist theory in the next few slides, they would claim that we have some neurological predisposition to acquire language. So we have some innate constraints that are going to influence how we acquire language, but they're also going to facilitate that acquisition. And if that sounds kind of weird and vague, it's because it's weird and vague. But we will talk about these sort of theoretical frameworks, I guess, theoretical frameworks within ourselves that allow us to learn language quickly, and they'd have some kind of biological inborn quality to them. That's not the only evidence against Skinner's theory here. So yes, it can't explain this overwhelming and rapid explosion of vocabulary, but also when they've done specific studies that look at, well, what kind of interactions do parents have with their children while they're learning language? We'd have some predictions where if it is all about the environment, it's all about consequences and feedback, then we would expect that parents should be correcting children for any kind of error that they're making. Did they pronounce the word wrong? Okay, let's correct that. Did they conjugate the word incorrectly? So did you say that you goed to the park instead of you went to the park? Do the parents correct that? What is it that the parents are and are not correcting? And do they give praise every time that you get it right? So when they actually broke it down and looked at those interactions and what kinds of errors the children make and the parents' responses, they found that the only types of errors that the parents will correct are semantic errors. So if you and the child have been to a park and the child is all excited and said, "We goed to the park," parents are very likely to agree. They're not going to correct the error of sort of conjugating that verb. They aren't going to say, no, we went to the park. They'd be like, yeah, we were at the park. That's close enough. That's good. Whereas if the child said that they goed to the mall or they went to the mall when they hadn't, the parents would correct that. So they only correct those big mistakes in terms of meaning, but things like grammar, not so much. And from that, that's just another nail in the coffin for this specific theory, saying, okay, well, if it's all about consequences and corrections and positive reactions to good things and negative reactions to bad things, well, do we actually see that? And the answer is no. So from that, children wouldn't even be getting enough feedback to learn at even a fraction of the rate that we see. They tend to just learn from watching others, listening to others, and experiencing it themselves. So we have two major talking points against this theory being our only explanation. And that's why we'll say there is some evidence for parts of it, but this theory on its own is not sufficient. And that's why we get to then move on and say, okay, well, what are our alternatives? What's next? So as per usual, I have done that thing where I've hinted at what we'll be talking about next, where with Chomsky and our nativist theory, if they are against Skinner's behavioral theory of this idea that it's all the environment, and we've said, well, some people will now argue that there's some innate predisposition towards acquiring language, we should then be unsurprised that Chomsky's nativist theory is all about that predisposition that humans have towards producing language. So Chomsky argued that our brains evolved over time to be able to produce language. So we can absolutely tell a story about the selective pressures affecting our brains, and they would press for us to get better at learning language and get better at using language. If we take that step back and do that sort of evolutionary approach, we'd say, okay, well, what does language give us? What are the benefits? Well, we've already talked about passing information from one individual to another. So by having language, we're able to talk about more complicated things. We're now able to plan for the future. We're able to talk about things that are not physically present. We can talk about things that happened in the past. And all of these sort of bits of flexibility in sharing information actually end up making us much, much better at surviving and thriving. So if you can now plan with your hunting party on what you're going to do, you might increase your odds of survival. If you can share what has helped in the past when you had drought conditions, even though you haven't experienced them in your lifetime, but say the elders in your community have been able to tell you that information, now you've sort of improved your ability to survive if those conditions ever come back again. So we can absolutely tell this evolutionary tale of there being very strong benefits to being better at using language and learning it and sort of acting upon what you've learned from language. And so that is our starting point, saying, yes, there would have been some selective pressure for some genetic component within our bodies that allows us to learn and produce language. Because as per usual, if we talk about evolution and that natural selection acting upon traits, that only really works if the traits that are being selected for have some genetic component. Otherwise, while the trait might allow you to survive and reproduce more, you can't pass something along if there's no genetic component to pass to your offspring. So we have that built-in assumption. But yeah, so there must be some genetic component, some biological built-in bit. And that's why we call it something that is innate or native, something that we are born with. And so Chomsky calls this his language acquisition device, the LAD. And the LAD is just that abstract framework. He doesn't describe what physical structure it is. He doesn't even know exactly how it works. He just says that we see a lot of things where we're learning faster than we can explain using other theories. We're having consistencies across different cultures and across different languages. And all of these pieces of evidence are telling us that there must be some biological predisposition that exists in all humans. And the logic across that is, as per usual, if we're seeing consistency across all cultures, all languages, even in communities where they haven't necessarily interacted with other cultures, we'd say that we see the same thing over and over again, and it can't be learned. Therefore, we're seeing it repeated because there is that innate component, because it's genetically influenced, because it is something unique to being human. And that's the argument here. And one of the things that were really, really important to this idea was the concept of our critical periods for language acquisition. So what Chomsky and others noticed was that children are very sensitive and very quick at learning language, basically up until the point they hit puberty. And if we look at special case studies where, say, children have been raised in isolation, whether it's from severe cases of abuse or abandonment, the sort of stereotypical raised by wolves examples. But if children are separate from other humans until after puberty, even if they're brought back into society and exposed to language, their language production tends to be less fluid. It tends to be a lot more difficult for them to put words together in a normal way. Whereas if children are brought back to society before puberty, they often recover and bounce back and end up being able to produce normal language because they were within that critical period. So these pieces of evidence, this sort of predisposition and almost like us having that boost to learning during that window, is what started this idea. It shows that there's probably some biological constraint before puberty that helps us or facilitates our language acquisition. Though, as I've mentioned on the slides here, the term critical period was proposed to imply that there's a hard cutoff. Basically, if you don't learn language by puberty, you will never learn it properly. However, in practice, it ends up being closer to what we might call a sensitive period. And that's the more accepted term nowadays, is sensitive period. Because while it is easier before puberty, it's not impossible afterwards. It's just more difficult. So instead of it being a harsh cutoff, all or nothing, like a critical period would say, we would actually see it as more of a soft edge, where it's not completely impossible, it's just a little bit more challenging. So they changed the term to sensitive period to match the evidence that we received. And so in this case, if we wanted some more evidence that gives us support, other than just our critical or sensitive periods, what other similarities do we see? And like I said, we're using that logic of if we see this in many or most or even all other languages, that gives us the idea that there's that innate component, but we see lots and lots of consistencies. So regardless of the language, regardless of the culture, we typically see that children are going to learn nouns before verbs. So they're going to learn the names for things before they learn the names for actions. So maybe we have something as part of our language acquisition device that sort of focuses in our attention on things. It might also be something to do with the fact that you can point to a thing and learn the word for it a little bit easier than something abstract like an action. But we're pointing it out as consistency gives us the idea that there might be a genetic component. We also see some consistencies in grammatical structures across cultures. So the rules for how things are combined, we're going to have similar types of rules regardless of the language. As we've mentioned before, though, the rules themselves, the specific application might be slightly different. The consistencies that we find is that each language has a rule. So they might have a rule about does the noun come first or does the verb come first? And the fact that some will say noun first and some will say verb first isn't really concerning because they all have a rule about how they should relate to one another. So the specific application can change depending on the language, but the overarching existence of rules is what we care about here. And another thing is the default tendency towards gestures. So when people talk, we tend to gesture with our hands. And you even see this very, very young. And as per usual, the younger we start seeing certain tendencies, the more certain we are that there's some innate component. So if you've seen children asking for something and they make their little grabby hands gesture, that's a request, and it's all gotten across through actions, not necessarily words. We can even go all the way back to looking at early predispositions with babbling, that ability to produce all of the possible sounds that then get refined to only the language or languages that you will produce. That also gives us an idea of something that was innate to begin with and then gets modified through learning. So that's kind of a nice bridge to get us starting to think about what we'll talk about with our emergentist perspectives and some of the related concepts in this area, where we start bridging that gap between saying that it's all native, it's all inborn mechanisms, or environmentalist/behavioralist, saying that it is all external learned things from our environment. We'll settle somewhere in the middle with the next few topics, which we'll discuss in the next video.